On the morning of September 23, 1851, a small hunting party deep in the Adirondack wilderness of upstate New York stumbled upon something they would never forget. Hidden beneath the dense forest canopy stood a rough log cabin, weathered and nearly invisible in the shadows of the trees. Inside, they discovered a boy no older than 12, thin to the bone, his eyes wild and unblinking. He spoke in sounds and rhythms that no one recognized, a jumble of guttural clicks and broken tones, more like the cries of animals than the words of any known tongue. The cabin told a darker story. Scattered across the floor were bones arranged in deliberate patterns, while strange carved markings covered the walls from floor to ceiling. In the corner lay a stack of journals filled with writings and diagrams that described practices so disturbing that the men could not bring themselves to speak of them aloud. When local authorities investigated, they were so shaken by what they found that the records were sealed, almost immediately buried in county archives, and classified under a cryptic label, Harwick Incident Access, restricted by order of the state. This discovery marked the beginning of one of the most unsettling chapters in New York's early history. The story of Benjamin Harwick, in a language that seemed to have no place in the world. To understand how such a case could even exist, it is important to look at the time and place that shaped it. The Adirondack region, in 1851, sat at the crossroads of two very different Americas. While the cities of Albany and New York were humming with industry steamships on the Hudson and telegraph wires binding communities together, the vast northern wilderness remained nearly untouched. It was a land of endless forests, hidden valleys, and scattered lakes, known only to native tribes who had hunted there for centuries. Settlers who dared push into this territory often lived in complete isolation, cut off from neighbors by miles of rugged terrain. Into this world came the Harwick family. In the brutal winter of 1836, Ezra Harwick and his wife Sarah sought out the wilderness as their refuge. Ezra, a man torn between intellect and obsession, had once been a school teacher in Vermont and New England. But his growing disillusionment with what he saw as the corruption and greed of society drove him to abandon civilization altogether. Sarah, the educated daughter of a failed Connecticut merchant, not only shared his ideals, but also brought with her a small inheritance that funded their dream of building a purer life away from commerce and convention. They believed they could escape the chaos of financial panics. Materialism and social upheavals sweeping through the country by carving out an isolated existence on their own terms. The hidden valley they chose was not only difficult to reach, but nearly impossible to stumble upon, a natural fortress sealed off by ridges and dense forests. It was here, far removed from the eyes of the world, that the Harwicks began a life that would slowly and tragically turn into something beyond recognition. The Harwick Valley could only be reached through a steep mountain pass that turned deadly once the snow set in. But within that hidden pocket of wilderness, the land was just enough to sustain life. A clear stream ran down the center, offering fresh water through every season, while the wooded slopes teemed with game and supplied timber for shelter and fuel. For years, the Harwicks thrived as a model of frontier self-reliance. Ezra, once a school teacher, quickly mastered the ways of the hunter and trapper. Sarah, with her rare education and inherited medical books, became skilled in preserving food, treating illness with herbs, and handling the countless tasks of survival. Their first child, Benjamin, arrived in 1839 during a brutal winter. Ezra, with nothing but Sarah's mother's medical texts to guide him, delivered the boy himself. That birth changed everything. Ezra grew fiercely protective, convinced the world beyond the ridges threatened the purity of his family. When wandering traders or hunters stumbled into the valley, he treated them with stiff politeness, but made it clear their presence was unwelcome. The births of daughters Martha in 1841 and Rebecca in 1844 only deepened his obsession. To Ezra, his children were not just his family, but a kind of experiment in human purity, raised free from what he saw as the poison of society. He began telling Sarah that the outside world corrupted children with false ideas and artificial values. Education became his crusade. With the few volumes they had brought from Vermont, Ezra turned their cabin into a schoolhouse. The children learned not only reading, writing, and numbers, but also philosophy, natural history, and what Ezra called true moral reasoning. His personal system of ethics, rooted in what he claimed were natural laws. Over time, his teaching grew stranger. He insisted that ordinary language was tainted by civilization filled with words that distorted thought. Slowly, he began stripping vocabulary from their lessons, inventing new words that he said revealed deeper truths about human existence. The last time anyone outside saw Ezra was in the spring of 1847, when he made one final journey to the logging town of Newcomb. Jeremiah Foster, a merchant who had traded with him for years later, recalled the unsettling visit. Ezra seemed thinner, hollow-eyed, with a strange intensity in his manner. He bought odd supplies, barrels of salt, a disturbing number of knives, and medical books that focused on anatomy and surgical practices. Foster remembered, too, that Ezra's speech had changed. His sentences fell into odd rhythms, with unfamiliar words slipped into otherwise normal conversation, as if part of him no longer belonged to the English tongue. When asked about his family, Ezra had delivered an answer that chilled Foster long after. He spoke of a great work he was carrying out with his wife and children, a process of purification, he said, that would lift them above the corruption of the civilized world. Ezra told Foster that his children were no longer speaking in the corrupted words of civilization, but were instead learning what he called the true language of natural existence, a way of communicating that would let them see reality without the false concepts imposed by society. After that strange encounter in 1847, the Harwicks seemed to disappear altogether. Trappers who once caught glimpses of smoke rising from their hidden valley now reported nothing for months or even years. Some assumed they had gone deeper into the wilderness. Others guessed they had abandoned their homestead, or perhaps succumbed to sickness, starvation, or the dangers of frontier life. The truth of what happened during those years of complete isolation would only begin to surface later, pieced together through the cryptic journals left behind in the cabin and the slow, painstaking work of communicating with Benjamin. What investigators uncovered would challenge everything people believed about human nature and how isolation could bend the very structure of the mind. The hunting party that stumbled into the Harwick Valley in 1851 was made up of 3 men each with skills that would prove vital. James Culver, a merchant from North Creek who also served as a constable, was accustomed to enforcing order in scattered settlements. His brother-in-law, Thomas Brennan, had lived half his life in the Adirondack woods, first as a logger and later as a wilderness guide for wealthy sportsmen from the cities. The third man, Dr. William Schuyler, had joined mostly out of curiosity, hoping to collect rare medicinal plants rumored to grow in the high mountain meadows. None of them knew their expertise would be tested in ways they could never have imagined. That September morning, they were tracking a large buck Brennan believed would feed his family through the coming winter. The trail carried them higher into the mountains than they had ever ventured, winding through groves of ancient pine and hemlock that cast the forest floor into a green twilight even at midday. The silence was so complete that every footstep and snapped twig seemed loud enough to echo. It was Brennan who first saw the sign that something was not right. Rising from the trees ahead was a thin column of gray smoke in a part of the forest that should have been untouched by human settlement. Any sign of habitation in such remote territory demanded caution, so they pressed on quietly. As they drew closer, details began to emerge that set their nerves on edge. The trail itself seemed unnaturally clear, as though someone had shaped animal paths into a crude walkway. Then the smell reached them. It was heavy, clinging to the still September air, a sickly sweetness that Brennan recognized instantly as carrion. But woven through that stench was something else, a human odor, the sour reek of unwashed bodies, confined too long in close quarters, mixed with another note neither Brennan nor Culver could place, though it made their skin crawl. The closer they came, the more unsettling signs they noticed. The forest floor was littered with bones, some picked clean, others splintered as though broken with tools. Tree trunks bore odd markings, carved in strange angular lines. And with every step toward the source of the smoke, the feeling grew stronger that they were approaching something meant to stay hidden. The deeper the men pressed into the forest, the stranger the signs became. The trees bore deliberate cuts, arranged not like random scratches from claws, but as symbols etched with intent. Some looked like crude figures of people locked in strange poses, others like geometric shapes bound by a logic none of them could follow. In too many places, the grooves had been filled with a dark, dried substance that only could have been blood. It was as if a trail of warnings had been laid out, pulling them deeper towards something they already wished they hadn't found. When the cabin appeared at last through a curtain of tangled undergrowth, it seemed less like a home and more like a construction of purpose. The walls were made from rough logs, sealed with clay and moss, the roof a patchwork of bark and animal hides. But the design showed skill and careful planning. What unsettled the men most was how naturally it blended into the forest, as though it had been meant to hide rather than shelter. Around the clearing, more symbols covered trees and rocks, forming a ring of strange protection. Bones dangled from branches overhead, clacking softly in the wind, like grotesque ornaments. Even the ground seemed marked, disturbed in patterns that felt deliberate, as if some ritual had been performed there again and again. The door hung slightly open, swaying on its crude hinges. Constable Culver stepped forward and called out, announcing himself in his official voice and asking if anyone within needed aid. The reply that came made the hair on the back of their necks rise. A boy's voice answered, young, high, and urgent, but the sounds carried no trace of English or any familiar tongue. The speech poured out in rapid bursts, broken by clicks of the tongue, guttural growls, and sharp inhalations. Yet it had rhythm and form, as if it were a real language with rules of its own. The tone shifted as it continued, rising in urgency, almost pleading, as though the speaker was desperate to be understood. Dr. Schuyler, steeling himself, pushed the door wider and entered with Brennan and Culver behind him. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from a low fire smoldering in a crude stone hearth, casting the cramped room in a shifting gloom. At the center sat the source of the voice, a boy no more than 12, though his thin limbs and hollow cheeks made his age difficult to guess. His dark, tangled hair fell to his shoulders, greasy with dirt, and he wore rough clothes stitched from animal hides, the seams tied with sinew and marked with the same symbols that covered the clearing. Around him spread a scene that defied understanding. Bones, animal, and otherwise lay arranged in precise geometric patterns on the floor. Wooden tokens etched with the strange markings formed careful clusters, and among them were tools made from sharpened bones and bits of scavenged metal. The boy spoke more quickly at the sight of the men, his voice alive with layered inflections, his hands moving in gestures that seemed tied to the rhythm of his words. He pointed again and again to places in the cabin, as though trying to convey something vital, his urgency rising as if their failure to understand pained him. But it was not the boy that broke the men's composure. It was the cabin itself. Every surface had been carved with symbols. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor were crowded with markings, simple lines, spirals, circles, and complex arrangements that bent the eye and unsettled the mind. Some depicted figures in scenes of hunting or gathering, yet with details twisted toward rituals and acts no civilized man would name. Others resembled nothing known at all, abstract shapes that suggested ideas beyond language. Worst of all, many carvings had been filled with a blackened mixture of blood, charcoal, and fat, seeping into the wood until the whole place seemed alive, with a message too dark to grasp. The blackened carvings across the walls and ceiling seemed alive in the firelight, shifting and pulsing, as though the cabin itself carried some watchful, malevolent will. Dr. Schuyler forced his fear aside and knelt beside the boy, speaking softly as he examined him. The child answered in his strange tongue, the words tumbling out in structured bursts, each accompanied by sharp gestures toward different objects around the room. It was not random babble. Schuyler could tell there was meaning there, even if it was locked behind symbols no outsider could grasp. The boy's condition was grim. His body was little more than skin stretched over bone, his cheeks hollow, his eyes too large for his face. His skin bore marks that suggested not only the toll of exposure, but deliberate scarring, as if pain itself had been part of his upbringing. Then Schuyler saw his teeth. They had been filed to sharp points, grotesque tools suited not for eating bread or vegetables, but for tearing flesh. Yet what struck the men hardest was not the boy's deformities, but his calm. He did not cry for help. He did not look relieved. He sat with an unsettling composure, as though this life of ritual and deprivation was not a nightmare, but his natural order. While Schuyler worked, Culver and Brennan searched the cabin. Beneath a heap of furs, they uncovered a set of bound journals. The handwriting was elegant, disciplined, and unmistakably educated. The earliest entries spoke of ordinary frontier life, hunting trips, farm work lessons for the children. But gradually the writing shifted. The author, almost certainly Ezra Harwick, began describing something he called the refinement of humanity, the purification of instincts. Each entry moved further into obsession until the pages became filled with ravings about language morality and experiments in reshaping human nature itself. Worse awaited under the floorboards. Hidden caches contained crude surgical tools, glass jars with unknown residues, and collections of human teeth and finger bones arranged like ornaments. Detailed anatomical sketches annotated in multiple languages and marked with the same cryptic symbols carved into the walls revealed that this was not just ideology, it had been put into practice. The three men exchanged horrified glances, but their first duty was clear. They had to get the boy out. Yet removing Benjamin proved almost impossible. When Schuyler coaxed him toward the doorway, the boy resisted with frantic urgency, not from attachment, but from terror. His strange speech grew sharper, his hands slicing the air in desperate gestures toward the cabin. He was warning them, pleading with them not to break rules they could not understand. When they finally managed to lead him into the open air, his cries turned to warnings about transgressions, about taboos that his rescuers had no way to interpret. What he feared was unclear, but his panic was real. The trip back to North Creek took 2 long days. Benjamin was too weak to move quickly, forcing them to carry or guide him carefully along the rough paths. Schuyler kept his notebook close, recording every detail. He quickly realized that the boy's language was not chaos, but a fully developed system with structure and rules. His vocal patterns followed clear grammar. His gestures were purposeful and consistent. He even displayed the ability to express abstract concepts beyond the capacity of most children. Yet the language was not the only shock. Along the way, Benjamin revealed skills far beyond his years. He identified edible plants without hesitation, tracked animal signs with uncanny precision, and showed knowledge of survival methods that even Brennan, the seasoned woodsman, found startling. Most disturbing of all, he demonstrated a chilling familiarity with butchering techniques, his descriptions and gestures suggesting first-hand experience in practices Schuyler dared not dwell on. Benjamin's eating habits revealed as much about his upbringing as his strange speech. Though he accepted bread stews and other normal provisions, he clearly preferred meat that was scarcely cooked almost raw. He displayed a startling knowledge of anatomy, knowing which parts of animals carried the most nourishment and consuming them with ritualistic care. His meals followed patterns that resembled formal rites rather than ordinary hunger, suggesting that food for him carried deep cultural or spiritual meaning. When the hunters finally brought him to North Creek, he was placed in the care of Reverend Samuel Hatton and his wife Elizabeth, a couple known for sheltering orphans from frontier tragedies. Their home, a solid two-story house that doubled as a community gathering place, soon became the center of efforts to rehabilitate and understand the boy. Yet challenges emerged immediately. Benjamin seemed genuinely baffled by everyday social norms. Privacy meant nothing to him. The idea of personal belongings or respecting another's space was foreign. His attempts to express himself full of rapid words and urgent gestures often escalated into frustrated outbursts that frightened the H-Ton's other wards. Elizabeth H-Ton, patient and experienced with troubled children, recognized that his difficulties went far beyond language. He lived by a set of moral rules entirely alien to society's expectations. Acts that others considered monstrous or depraved, he accepted without hesitation as natural, while the most ordinary customs manners, kindness sharing, confused and unsettled him. Dr. Schuyler, realizing the magnitude of the case, wrote extensively to colleagues in Albany and New York City. His letters described not just a linguistic puzzle, but a profound psychological enigma, a child trained to think and behave in ways that undermined the very foundations of human society. His appeals caught the attention of Professor Marcus Delacroix of Columbia College, an expert in comparative linguistics known for studying isolated dialects across Europe and the frontier. Delacroix arrived in North Creek in late October 1851, and after only a short examination, confirmed Schuyler's fears. Benjamin's speech was not a corrupted form of English, nor any known frontier dialect. It was a fully constructed language created with intention and precision. Its grammar and vocabulary bore the marks of careful design, as though it had been engineered to serve a purpose far beyond simple communication. The professor's analysis revealed something chilling. This language did not merely allow Benjamin to describe his world. It shaped the very way he could think about it. Entire categories of moral and social concepts had no words, making them effectively unthinkable. He could not express ideas like fairness, individual rights, or opposition to authority. There was no vocabulary for cruelty, injustice, or moral wrongdoing. Yet the language contained elaborate terms for dominance, obedience, and submission, as well as a disturbingly detailed lexicon for death, decay, and the stages of bodily decomposition. As Delacroix painstakingly built a bridge of communication with gestures and objects, the boy's worldview began to emerge. He saw human relationships only in terms of hierarchy, masters and subordinates, rulers and the ruled. Concepts of equality or cooperation were absent. Nature itself to him was a cycle of death and transformation with an eerie fascination for the breaking down of flesh into its parts. Meanwhile, back in North Creek, Reverend H. Ton, Dr. Schuyler, and other educated townsmen pored over the journals recovered from the Harwick cabin, searching for answers to the origins of this dark experiment. What the journals revealed was not simply the story of a family's struggle in isolation, but a chilling chronicle of one man's deliberate descent into madness and the systematic destruction of everything that made his family human. The earliest entries painted Ezra Harwick as a thoughtful pioneer, documenting crops hunts and lessons for his children. But the tone shifted slowly at first, then with growing intensity. He began writing of purity transformation and the liberation of instincts he believed were shackled by society. To him, civilization was nothing but a prison of false morals and corrupted language, and he became obsessed with building a new system that would strip away those constraints. By late 1848, the writings took on a fevered quality. Ezra described what he called revelations, visions during long, dark winter nights in the Adirondacks. These revelations convinced him that morality itself was an artificial construct, a mask over humanity's true nature. From that point forward, his journals no longer read as reflections, but as doctrine. He laid out strict dietary codes meant to purify body and spirit, described rituals designed to erase ingrained social habits, and detailed harsh methods of isolation and deprivation. His goal was nothing less than the remaking of his wife and children into vessels of his new vision of human perfection. As winter deepened, Professor Delacroix in North Creek made breakthroughs that cast Ezra's journals in an even darker light. By carefully studying Benjamin's language, Delacroix began to see that it was not merely a tool of communication. It was a tool of transformation. The language itself was a machine designed to reshape consciousness. It contained precise terminology for processes of physical and psychological change terms that made mutilation or coercion sound natural, even beneficial. When Benjamin spoke of what had happened to his sisters Martha and Rebecca, he did so with a calm detachment, describing their transformation not as tragedy, but as necessary progress. His words carried no sense of horror, because his language had no place for such concepts. This was the most disturbing revelation of all. Benjamin's speech held no vocabulary for cruelty, injustice, or unnecessary suffering. The very idea of moral objection had been stripped out. Actions could only be judged by their effectiveness toward a goal, never by the worth of the goal itself. It was as though Ezra had engineered a world where obedience could not be questioned, because the language made questioning impossible. Meanwhile, Dr. Schuyler's continued work at the cabin unearthed more evidence to confirm what the language implied. Beneath the floorboards and hidden in caches around the clearing, he found additional journals, surgical instruments worn with use, and collections of human remains. Teeth bones and fragments of preserved tissue had been arranged with deliberate care, some even annotated as though they were specimens in an experiment. These later journals revealed Ezra's final transformation from an educated frontier teacher into a man who had abandoned every boundary of humanity in pursuit of his vision. By 1849, Ezra Harwick's journals had shifted into what he called the Great Work, a systematic program of purification that began with harsh diets and ritual isolation, but soon spiraled into practices no sane mind could justify. He was no longer merely rejecting society. He believed human nature itself had been poisoned by false consciousness, artificial mental structures imposed by civilization. His solution was not retreat, but reconstruction, tearing down his family's humanity and rebuilding it into what he imagined as perfected beings freed from moral restraint and capable of transcending ordinary human limits. The centerpiece of this program was the artificial language. Ezra described in chilling detail how he stripped away old words and ideas, replacing them with a system that erased the very possibility of resistance. In this new tongue, there were no terms for rebellion, no way to name cruelty or injustice, no space for independent thought. For Benjamin, language was not just how he communicated, but the frame that shaped his mind. His schooling was paired with starvation, sensory deprivation, and physical punishment until his original self had been ground down and replaced by something closer to his father's design. The journals revealed that Martha and Rebecca had been the first to undergo Ezra's most extreme experiments. He wrote of elaborate procedures meant to transform them into higher beings. But behind his lofty rhetoric lay rituals steeped in horror. Central to his system was the consumption of human flesh, not as survival cannibalism, but as a sacred act. To Ezra, it was a sacrament of transcendence, a ritual that bound his family to his artificial faith. Professor Delacroix's study of Benjamin's language confirmed this unspeakable truth. The boy possessed a vast vocabulary for the acts of butchery and consumption. But the words framed these deeds as holy rather than monstrous. The language made revulsion impossible. He could describe in precise clinical terms the cutting, the preparation, the eating. But he could not express disgust nor understand why others recoiled. Horror as a concept did not exist in his world. As Benjamin slowly learned English, more of the story surfaced. Piece by piece, he painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as spiritual progress. Ezra had convinced his family that survival and salvation depended on breaking every boundary of human decency. Each step deeper into depravity was presented as a necessary passage toward enlightenment. Sarah Harwick's transformation was perhaps the most tragic. At first, she resisted clinging to the values she had carried from Connecticut. But isolation, coercion, and her husband's relentless pressure wore her down. In time, she not only surrendered, but became his partner. Benjamin's halting English revealed that his mother had not merely complied. She had actively assisted in building the new language, enforcing the rituals, and overseeing the conditioning of her daughters. By the end, she was no longer resisting Ezra's madness, but amplifying it. Through Benjamin's fragmented testimony and the translations of his constructed speech, Professor Delacroix and the investigators came to grasp the full horror. The Harwick family had not fallen into desperate cannibalism. They had created a belief system around it. Ezra had built a philosophy, a language, and a set of practices that turned the systematic consumption of human beings into the cornerstone of his vision of transcendence. Benjamin was never meant to be just another participant in Ezra Harwick's so-called great work. The journals and Benjamin's own fragmented testimony revealed he had been singled out from birth as the intended survivor, the heir who would carry his father's system forward. His training went far beyond language and ritual. He had been systematically taught to identify victims, exploit their weaknesses, and use psychological pressure to erode their resistance until they could be remade into compliant offerings. Ezra had tried to shape him not only into a predator, but into a teacher of predators capable of passing the system on to others. The breakthrough that made this clear did not come from scholars or doctors, but from Elizabeth Hutton, who had been caring for Benjamin day and night in her home. Patient and observant, she began noticing patterns that others overlooked. At mealtimes, Benjamin treated food as though it carried hidden meaning. He lingered over meat that was undercooked, sniffing and examining it with an almost ritual intensity. When Professor Delacroix helped translate his mutterings, the truth emerged. Benjamin was not merely tasting for quality, he was evaluating. His judgments were based on things no ordinary child would think of: the health of the animal, its age, and something he chillingly called the fear taste. the notion that meat carried the imprint of the victim's emotional state when killed. Elizabeth also saw what others missed in his interactions with the town's children. On Sundays, when he was carefully escorted to church, Benjamin tried to teach his artificial language to the younger ones. What at first seemed like play turned out to be lessons. He was sharing what he considered essential knowledge methods of preparation and selection. Elizabeth was horrified to realize that he was not only repeating what had been done to him, but attempting to recruit others into the system his father had designed. When she reported this to Professor Delacroix, the scholar quickly recognized that Benjamin was not simply a damaged child, but a carefully prepared vessel of continuation. Ezra had groomed him to be the perpetuator of the great work. Delacroix arranged controlled sessions, hoping to guide Benjamin into revealing his knowledge, while slowly translating his artificial tongue into English. What emerged in those sessions left even hardened men shaken. Benjamin spoke with chilling precision about techniques for identifying, capturing, and processing human victims. He described psychological methods of breaking down resistance step by step, until victims accepted their own destruction as necessary. His language contained entire taxonomies of human beings, sorted according to their use. There were terms for quick meat, those to be consumed immediately, and long meat, those kept alive and methodically harvested. Victims were classified by age, health, resilience, and even flavor potential, a concept that reduced people to nothing more than the quality of their flesh. Most disturbing of all, Benjamin's vocabulary included an extensive set of terms for psychological manipulation. He could describe in matter-of-fact detail how to erode a person's sense of individuality, strip them of autonomy, and replace their moral framework with artificial values that made cooperation with their own demise seem rational. For Benjamin, these were not crimes or horrors. In the structure of the language he had been raised in, they were simply methods, logical, necessary, and unquestionable. Just as scholars and townsfolk were beginning to grasp the full horror of Ezra Harwick's great work, nature itself uncovered the most damning evidence. In late autumn, heavy rains triggered a landslide in the valley near the cabin. James Culver, who had been tasked with monitoring the site, organized a second expedition to examine the newly exposed ground. What they found beneath the earth transformed the case from a tale of madness and isolation into proof of deliberate, organized predation. Hidden beneath the cabin was a carefully constructed chamber, its entrance revealed only when the hillside gave way. Inside lay the remains of at least 8 people, arranged and preserved with chilling precision. The bones bore unmistakable signs of deliberate butchery and preparation, consistent with the methods Benjamin's artificial language had described in such clinical, detached detail. Far worse, investigators recognized items among the remains that linked some victims to trading parties and lone travelers who had passed through the Adirondack wilderness during the Harwick's years of supposed seclusion. This discovery shattered any lingering belief that the family's descent had been born of desperation. The evidence was clear: the Harwicks had not merely consumed one another. They had hunted and processed human beings over years, operating according to a systematic plan. What had seemed the private madness of a frontier recluse was exposed as a structured program of human predation, carried out under the guise of wilderness isolation. Dr. Schuyler's forensic analysis confirmed the implications. The remains were not the chaotic remnants of survival cannibalism, but the products of a practiced method. Victims were selected, killed, and preserved according to principles laid out in Ezra's writings and echoed in Benjamin's vocabulary. This was not survival. It was ritual philosophy and cold design. Benjamin's expanding grasp of English filled in further details. His accounts revealed how Ezra had used his education and civility as weapons, presenting himself to strangers as a guide, a teacher, or source of help in the wilderness. Once trust was gained, victims could be lured into the hidden valley, cut off from escape, and gradually broken down through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. Ezra's methods exploiting isolation, sowing confusion, dismantling moral frameworks, were designed to transform unwilling travelers into compliant participants in their own destruction. The underground chamber also revealed the disturbing extent of the family's organization. The remains had been sorted into categories that Benjamin's artificial language described with precise terminology, classifications that no ordinary mind would ever invent. Each victim was evaluated for qualities that determined not only their immediate use, but their long-term value. The system reflected years of refinement, an entire worldview, where people existed only as resources to be consumed. This revelation forced the authorities to confront questions they were utterly unprepared to answer. What could be done with a 12-year-old boy who had not only survived such a system, but had been trained as its inheritor? And how should society reckon with evidence of crimes so vast, so alien in their logic, that they threatened to redefine the boundaries of human depravity itself? Benjamin's growing command of English opened the final and most horrifying chapter of the Harwick case. By late December 1851, he was able to recount his family's last months with a clarity that left no room for doubt. What he revealed shocked even Professor Delacroix, who at first refused to accept the testimony, despite the mounting linguistic and physical evidence that corroborated it. According to Benjamin, Ezra Harwick had not died of illness accident or the hardships of frontier life as investigators initially assumed. Instead, Ezra had orchestrated his own consumption by his family. This was not survival cannibalism, but what he called the ultimate purification, the final stage of transformation into perfected predators. The ritual was deliberate, planned, and carried out with solemn devotion. Ezra had presented his death as a voluntary sacrifice, an offering that would bind his essence into his wife and children. Benjamin described the process with cold precision, using words from his artificial language that made it sound like a sacred duty rather than a crime. The linguistic system itself erased any possibility of recognizing the act as horror. There were no words for parental loyalty, for natural affection, or for the sacredness of kinship. In his language, consuming one's father was not murder, not betrayal, but a necessary step toward transcendence. As devastating as this revelation was, what followed proved worse. The absence of Martha's and Rebecca's remains from the cabin had fueled speculation that the girls had perished of disease or been lost in the wilderness. But Benjamin revealed a different truth. His sisters had been consumed as part of what Ezra called the stages of purification. Over an extended period, their bodies had been systematically incorporated into the family through rituals designed to erase every lingering attachment to human morality and replace it with devotion to Ezra's artificial belief system. The details Benjamin provided were clinical and detached, as though he were describing medical procedures rather than acts of cannibalism. His artificial vocabulary contained elaborate classifications for the uses of different body parts, framed as if each had distinct spiritual or physical benefits. In Ezra's twisted philosophy, nothing was wasted. Every stage of consumption carried meaning. Every act reinforced the destruction of old values and the creation of new ones. Most chilling of all was the realization that Benjamin had been spared not out of love, but out of design. Ezra had singled him out as the heir, the one most capable of carrying the work forward. His temperament, his resilience, his capacity to absorb the artificial language, all had marked him as the chosen survivor. Martha and Rebecca, in Ezra's words, achieved transcendence through incorporation, while Benjamin was groomed to inherit the system itself. The boy's testimony filtered through the strange grammar of his upbringing and slowly translated into English, revealed a program so systematic, so deliberate, that it transcended the boundaries of mere madness. It was a blueprint for turning human beings into instruments of predation. A philosophy in which family bonds, morality, and even humanity itself had been methodically dismantled and rebuilt in service of one man's vision. The underground chamber revealed more than just the remains of the Harwick's victims. It exposed the true scope of Ezra's ambition. What investigators found matched Benjamin's halting but increasingly coherent testimony. These were not desperate acts of survival, but the results of calculated recruitment operations. Ezra had lured travelers and traders into the valley under the guise of help or hospitality, only to subject them to the same purification process that had destroyed his daughters. Some captives were consumed quickly. Others, more disturbingly, were kept alive for months, subjected to a gradual program of isolation, deprivation, and manipulation until their resistance broke. Benjamin described with unsettling clarity how these victims were converted. At first they fought back, clinging to their old identities. But Ezra's methods wore them down, reframing horror as necessity, convincing them step by step to adopt pieces of the artificial language until the unthinkable seemed rational. In some cases, the victims went so far as to assist in capturing and preparing new arrivals. Ezra's methods, horrifyingly, had proven effective not only on his family but on outsiders who had once been ordinary men and women. The boy's linguistic knowledge showed the precision of this conditioning. His artificial tongue contained detailed terminology for every stage of psychological breakdown techniques for identifying vulnerable personalities, strategies for introducing progressively more disturbing practices, and methods for ensuring compliance without triggering collapse. In Benjamin's words, resistance wasn't crushed in a single blow. It was dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained to fight back. Dr. Schuyler's medical examinations revealed just how deeply Benjamin himself had been altered. His sharpened teeth were not accidental, but systematically filed for tearing flesh. His digestive system showed signs of adaptation to a diet that included human tissue changes that could only have come from years of conditioning. He was not simply malnourished or misshapen by wilderness life. He had been deliberately engineered. Ezra had reshaped his son into what he believed to be the first of a new species, an apex predator who could pass as human while carrying within him the skills and mindset to prey on humanity itself. The artificial language reinforced this transformation. It wasn't only a tool for communication, but a cage for thought, a mental prison that eliminated the very possibility of moral objection. Within its framework, cannibalism was not monstrous, but necessary, not crime, but duty. Even more chilling, Benjamin's education had included instructions for spreading the language carefully, methodically, so that others could be converted in the same way. Ezra's vision had never been limited to his family. He saw them as the seed of a new order, with Benjamin as its missionary, a boy who could blend into society while quietly teaching others the words that would rewire their minds. By spring 1852, Professor Delacroix submitted his exhaustive report to state authorities. His conclusion was stark. Benjamin Harwick was a case without precedent in psychology, linguistics, or law. He was both victim and perpetrator child and predator human, and something deliberately remade into a different kind of being. Conditioned so completely he could not even comprehend why others recoiled from his story. To him, his family system was not horror, but truth. By the spring of 1852, Benjamin Harwick had become one of the most disturbing enigmas ever faced by state officials. His artificial language, crafted by Ezra with such precision, was more than a means of communication. It was a system of control that rewired thought itself. Professor Delacroix's final report made this clear. The language had been engineered to erase the very possibility of moral judgment, stripping away the conceptual framework necessary for compassion, justice, or resistance. In its place, it imposed a rigid worldview of predation and obedience, a psychological prison that made escape nearly impossible. The question of Benjamin's future required unprecedented deliberation. He was at once a victim and a potential predator, a child molded into something other than human. Criminal punishment was meaningless for one who had no framework to understand guilt, while ordinary therapy seemed powerless against conditioning, so deeply woven into his mind. After months of debate among doctors, officials, and clergy, the decision was made Benjamin would be placed in the state asylum at Utica. There, under constant supervision, he would become the subject of one of the first systematic attempts at undoing psychological conditioning. Dr. Schuyler and Professor Delacroix devised a program aimed at dismantling Ezra's artificial language by slowly reintroducing conventional speech and moral ideas. Step by step, Benjamin was exposed to ordinary concepts of family friendship and fairness, ideas that to him were alien. His progress was uneven and agonizingly slow. He clung to his artificial tongue as if it were sacred knowledge, growing frustrated and even panicked when English left him unable to express concepts he considered vital. The sense of loss haunted him, as though normal language were stripping away his identity rather than healing it. Over the years, Benjamin learned to suppress the impulses his father had instilled, but it was suppression, not recovery. Staff at the asylum noted that he often seemed to live behind a mask of normalcy, carefully monitoring himself to act appropriately. His morality never seemed to arise naturally. Instead, it appeared as a conscious performance, the result of discipline rather than genuine change. He could function within society's rules, but only by constant effort, never by instinct. By 1857, Benjamin vanished from official record. He would have been around 18. Conflicting reports cloud his fate. Some documents suggest he was quietly released under a new identity, resettled far from New York. Others hint at escape or a secret transfer to a federal facility, where his existence could be more tightly controlled. No verified trace of his adult life has ever surfaced. The state, determined to bury the Harwick legacy, sealed the files and bound all involved under strict oaths of secrecy. Ezra's journals and Professor Delacroix's research notes were locked away, classified to prevent their rediscovery. The cabin was burned, the valley declared off-limits, and the underground chamber permanently sealed. Even within the archives, the case survived only under a cryptic label, the Harwick Incident Access, restricted by order of the state. Privately, a few officials admitted to lingering fears. Benjamin had been systematically prepared to inherit Ezra's mission, to spread the artificial language, to seed its concepts into others, until the work consumed more than one family. If he survived beyond 1857, some whispered Ezra's dream may not have died with him. The Harwick case remains one of the most unsettling reminders in American history of how fragile the boundaries of humanity truly are. It shows that under the right pressures, systematic manipulation, isolation, and the deliberate reshaping of thought, ordinary families can be turned into something unrecognizable. Ezra Harwick's obsession did more than destroy his wife and children. It demonstrated how language itself can be weaponized not just to communicate, but to alter consciousness, to erase morality, and to make the unthinkable seem inevitable. Benjamin's story raises questions that linger far beyond the Adirondacks of the 1850s. If a child could be so thoroughly remade, stripped of instinctive compassion, and reshaped into a vessel of predation, what does that say about the resilience or fragility of our moral instincts? How much of what we call humanity is innate, and how much depends on the social and linguistic structures that surround us. The Harwick incident suggests that the line between civilization and savagery may be thinner than we care to admit. The most chilling legacy of the case lies in Ezra's artificial language. It was not just words, but a system built to control thought, to close off entire categories of morality, and to reframe atrocity as virtue. It revealed a disturbing truth that human consciousness itself can be engineered, reshaped, and broken until even the most horrific practices feel natural, necessary, and sacred. And so the real horror of the Harwick story is not supernatural. It does not lie in ghosts or curses, but in what people can do to one another when cut off from the world and bound by belief systems of their own making. It is a tale of how language, ritual, and isolation can dismantle humanity one step at a time, until what remains no longer fits within the bounds of human community. What do you think? Was the full truth ever revealed, or do sealed archives still conceal details too disturbing for the public to know? Could Benjamin have lived on, carrying fragments of his father's vision into other corners of the continent? Share your theories in the comments, and let us know if you believe monsters like the Harwicks might still exist hidden away in forgotten valleys. If this story gave you chills, subscribe, hit the bell, and share it with a friend who loves mysteries that push the boundaries of what it means to be human. See you in the next video.